and welcome everybody to the final panel of the Denver Design and Review Symposium hosted by Denver Inter-Neighborhood Cooperation. Again, it's amazing to be here at Loretta Heights, this historic college that is on the face of change as well. And I think we're here having a conversation about change, about how we want to see our city grow and what we want it to look like. And for our final panel, it's where and how for the Denver's future. And we're going to be talking about Blueprint Denver. We're going to be talking about design review and landmark preservation. And for that, we put together a panel for you. To my left here is Brad Evans, who formed Denver Fugly, which, is, those who don't know, is a Facebook group that has somehow gotten thousands of people to talk about, 9,000 to be exact, people to talk about urban planning, about design of buildings. I think it's an amazing feat. Next up, we have Gorrell from Gorrell, Giles, and Golatta PC. He's a real estate attorney and the former chair of the historic Denver board. To his left is Sarah Showalter from the City and County of Denver. She is the citywide planning manager. To her left is Amy Zimmer from the Denver Landmark Preservation Commission. And then to her left is John Olson from Historic Denver. He's the deputy director. And so without that, I want to start by saying, what is Denver, what is design review? And for us, the definition we came up to, it's a process in which the city reviews the architectural and site planning elements of a development project to ensure that it meets the highest standards of design and is compliant with the characteristics of the surrounding neighborhood or district. And so that's why we put together some people here who are involved in the decision-making process. And also, we'll have you start, Brad, having a conversation about what people's opinions are that aren't in power.
My name is Brad Evans, creator of Denver Fugly, Denver Cruiser Ride. So I'm a famous mess maker in Denver and questioner of the status quo. I think the challenge that I've had as a kind of an outsider in this process is how does the process work? How do we interact as citizens with the process? And then I think the greater conversation of what is good design and what is bad design. So that's kind of the architecture of what I've started creating with Denver Fugly, is just asking, is this the future that we want for Denver? And what role do we as citizens play in it? So that's really kind of like the conversation. We tried to be as little, particularly with Denver Fugly, have tried to be as little like next door neighbor as possible and really try to elevate the conversation about design and make it so that from the person who doesn't know anything about design to the person who knows everything about design to have a conversation, because I think that's how we'll make Denver great in the future, without using that awful phrase again. But I think it's up to all of us to have that conversation and have honest conversations about what we want Denver to look like. So to me, that's the core of everything I've been doing with Denver Fugly, is to pick on the bad stuff and make sure we don't do it again. You get to talk about yourself.
All right. I'm Terry Gorrell. My connection to this college is that over 50 years ago, I had two sisters who went to college here when it really was Loretta Heights College. So, and this building was here, and I always remember as a 10-year-old, the first time I came in here and saw this view and thought, as a kid from Kansas, what an incredible place. And, usually in Colorado, they ask the kid from Kansas how he likes Colorado, and he says, I don't know, you can't see it for the mountains. But I moved to Colorado in '76 and have been here since then and love it. I live in a historic neighborhood near Cheeseman Park in a house built in 1905. I am a real estate development attorney, which usually carries lots of connotations that aren't the best in a group like this, but you may be surprised at some of my views. Actually, for my kind of practice, the better I do my practice, the less you know me or know who I am or see me, because I work behind the scenes, but I do it across the country in all forms of development, from residential to commercial to medical and educational campuses, resort practices here and in Mexico. So I've had at least the opportunity to be involved in a lot of land use planning, including some significant amounts of that here in the Front Range, probably the most significant of which is the redevelopment of the business area in Highlands Ranch, which was originally developed by residential real estate developers who knew nothing about the creation of a business park. So when we came in and made that the Lucent Park, we had to totally redevelop that. But in other things, I've worked on developments transit-oriented near Denver International Airport, and then in my connection, the beneficial connection I've had with Historic Denver over the years been very involved in adaptive reuse, which is one of the hallmarks of Historic Denver that I've always been the proudest of.
Hi everyone, my name is Sarah Showalter, and I work for the City of Denver in Community Planning and Development. I am actually a Denver native. I was born and raised in Denver and came to want to be a planner and urban designer because of driving through neighborhoods as a kid and being confused why some neighborhoods looked really nice and other ones didn't, and that didn't seem quite right, and getting really drawn to the built environment and wanting to make neighborhoods better. I got a degree in urban planning with a specialty in urban design and lived in a lot of other cities, including New York City and Philadelphia, and practiced planning, and really was inspired by living in some of those other cities by how great design can be and what great neighborhoods can look like. But was very excited to come back to Denver about 10 years ago. I've been here ever since and have started a family here. And I am committed to working for the City of Denver because I want to make Denver better. I love Denver. I think it's a wonderful place to live and full of many great neighborhoods. And share, I think, a lot of concerns in the community about some of the lack of quality and some of the more recent redevelopment we've been having. So I'm very passionate about design and really trying to make a great city.
My name is Amy Zimmer. I am on the Denver Landmark Preservation Commission. I'm actually just coming sort of to the end of my term. I've been on there for almost 7 years now. So I am an architectural historian. So what I do is tell the stories of buildings. And what we have in here in Denver is just some amazing, amazing architecture and amazing stories. And I'm working to try and preserve the buildings so that not only is our wonderful historic architecture and character of our city keeps constant, but also that we don't forget the amazing stories of the history of our city. I live at Park Hill in a 1909 house, and I'm very privileged to do that. And I also am formerly involved with the Capitol Hill United Neighborhoods. Really got my a lot of my start in preservation advocacy through that organization as well. So thank you all for coming today and for having me on the panel.
And last and very least, this is John Olson. I'm Deputy Director with Historic Denver. I come from a history of preservation for most of my career. I actually started with the National Trust for Historic Preservation out of grad school, and I did a lot of rural preservation. I was doing barn restoration in another life all across the country, and so it's very interesting. I'm an urban kid, but doing rural preservation, I got eye-opening aspects of the beauty of barns in particular, but also farm construction and outbuildings and rural towns and how those interact. And then I've come back to the urban aspect as with Historic Denver. In between, I was also working with in private architecture as well. But in the nonprofit world at Historic Denver, we're very much, of course, wanting to preserve and advocate for those designated buildings that we have in Denver. But right now, that's only 5% of our Denver built environment. And yet, as many people know, as they go all across the city, much of our city is still, I want to say still, very historic or eligible to be historic. There's a lot of great infill buildings and contextual buildings out there that have some great historic integrity. And so Historic Denver is not just about the designated buildings, we're about those buildings, and we're also just about good urban design. How does our city have that base, that wonderful base that makes us unique? And how do we grow? Because we're going to grow. And the growth is happening, and the growth is exciting. But how do we do that and still keep our soul as Denver and as a unique place in the Rocky Mountain West? So that's the environment that I'm coming at it with, and I'm very happy to be here. Thank you.
Yes. Yes. Claps for everybody on this panel. I'm so blown away by how many people are willing to give their time to Denver INC. It's great. I do want to come back full circle to why we're having this symposium in the first place, because the membership asked for this, because it's very timely with the blueprint timeline, the comprehensive planning process for the next 20 years in Denver. We have until October 31st to submit our comments from the community. I do want to make it known that Denver INC has requested an extension. If that is something you support or believe needs to happen, then you also can write the city in support of it. That being said, if we talk about design and design review within the actual Blueprint Denver, and again, for those who don't know what Blueprint Denver is, it's a zoning and transportation plan, trying to work them together. There were several recommendations that were made, I believe 5 in total. And the first one makes claim to the fact that we want everyone to have equal access to design tools. So the tools as they're defined by the city is their design review, both board administered and staff administered, historic designation, conservation overlays, design overlays, and form-built standard code changes. So I want to start with just the conversation around board administered versus staff administered, and I was hoping, Sarah, you could talk about some pros and cons and what the real actual costs are, if that's the way we would like to go.
Sure. Yeah, I think there's a lot of pros to both approaches. I'll start with doing a design review through a board. Obviously, a huge advantage of that is being able to kind of handpick and select experts that have knowledge about design and development to do design review and familiarize themselves with the design standards and guidelines to review projects against. We see a lot of kind of culture, and I almost want to use the term peer pressure that comes from a board that can be very beneficial. So sometimes when staff is having a conversation with somebody that's proposing a project and really trying to push great design, it's just a different dynamic than going in front of a board of your peers and other designers and having them really trying to push the envelope. And so I think that's a huge advantage of a board. And one of the reasons why Blueprint Denver and the recommendation calls for having more of them, particularly in our really high-profile areas like downtown. On a con, however, though I think Ian was really hitting on, is the resources. I don't know if we have to call that a con per se, but just something to be aware of is as we do more of them, that means more staff from the city to staff the boards, to take the time to have a successful board. You really want to train the people that are on the board, make sure they understand what the design review process should look like and the role the board plays. Definitely learn the design standards and guidelines that they're implementing. And then, of course, the board members rotate over time, so there's a lot that goes into doing orientation and training of the board over time. And then the time that it takes to actually write design standards and guidelines so that the board has something that they're judging projects against is also a big resource. So again, not so sure we need to call it a con as much as being really aware that it does take a lot of extra both staff time. We have a lot of in-house architects and urban designers that are able to write great design standards and guidelines, but of course we like to involve the community in writing them and stakeholders and other designers and experts to help test them. So it usually takes us at least a year to write design standards and guidelines, and then it takes quite a bit of staff time to actually administer the board. A lot of it might sound like details, but you add it all up from setting the agendas, making sure you're meeting all of the public review notice so that people know the meeting is happening, and then providing all the support to the board members. So when you do staff administrated design review, one of the advantages is that there's a little less in terms of having to kind of curate and support the board over time. But it's still a huge resource demand that way as well, because you need more staff time at the city to, right now, as you probably know, a lot of the city does not have a design review process. And so if we want to add that more, which is definitely what Blueprint Denver, the public draft, calls to do, it means more staff where we'd want to do staff administered. And it'd be a very similar process for creating the design standards and guidelines that they would administer over time. As it would be with a board, where you have, at least a year and a lot of community input on what the actual design standards should be.
Awesome. So my next question is actually for Amy. And The second tool here that's being discussed is landmark designation, and it's my understanding that the landmark ordinance is under review, and they're considering some changes to it, and there's a task force. Can you speak at all to that?
Yes, so there is currently a task force to review what is going on with the landmark ordinance in Denver. The landmark does get reviewed periodically to see if it's still, if the different things are still working in the ordinance. They do currently have a task force that is sort of takes various different approaches to landmarks. So we've got representatives from our city councilman here is a member of that, but as well there are members from the development community as well as preservation advocates on there. So it's trying to get a conversation between those two communities and see how there can be a compromise so that we can preserve our city. So there is some worry that the landmark ordinance is under attack. I don't think that that's true. I don't think it's going away, but I also encourage everybody to be vigilant of what's going on with that task force and to participate, because I've been told that nobody from the public comes to those meetings and the public is invited to them. So if you are concerned about what's going on with landmark, I encourage you to attend those meetings and have your voice be heard. And also that goes for the actual landmark commission hearings as well, our regular hearings of the board. We do welcome public comment on all of the projects that we review. So we are very interested in what the neighborhoods have to say. You all are the ones who are living in the neighborhoods, and so we are very interested in the neighbors' view on these projects. It's not simply just our decision. We want to hear what you have to say.
Bridget, can we get that information later, and we'll continue with the panel?
We do post all of the task force meetings and Landmark Preservation Commission meetings on the website, the time and location, but we can get you. The City of Denver, www.denvergov.org.
Well, I think the challenges around public participation is part of the reason why we have this gentleman here. We're going to get to those kind of questions. I think Terry wanted to add something on.
It helps for you guys to have a focus when you're looking at something like a landmarks change. So let me give you one of the undercurrents. Presently, under the landmark code, if there's a revision to a historic district such as Larimer Square, there is a mandated involvement by the landmarks, and you can read it different ways, but let me just say that at least the way we read it is that landmarks will be required to approve a modification of the Larimer Square Historic District that would permit a new 40-story building to be built over the top of the existing buildings, in my view, in a manner which would make basically Disneyland out of Larimer Square. And if there's an undercurrent, and I'm not saying there is, but I'm saying watch for it, of minimizing or eliminating or a method of bypassing landmarks input and its fulcrum input into that decision, that would be something that would be very bad for Denver. So if you are going to take the time to review what's being proposed with landmarks, pay particular attention to efforts that might be made to minimize their gateway capacity in dealing with landmark changes and the mandated requirement as it currently is structured for there to deliver to the City Council a recommendation on what should happen with respect to any change of a designated historic site or district.
Okay. So my next question I have is for John. One of the other tools that's being discussed is a conservation overlay, which for those who don't know is design elements of a community, whether they be windows or the way the roof is shaped, that they would like to continue to have in new structures. And it's my understanding that Historic Denver and the city are looking at pattern books for neighborhoods to define these characteristics, and I was hoping you could just talk a little bit about that for our audience.
Certainly. We've done a number of projects that have involved pattern books for neighborhoods who are seeing the pressures. These are wonderful neighborhoods. These are places where people want to live. They're in great locations around Denver and Metro Denver. And In some of these places, the homes themselves are maybe early 20th century or late 19th century, or even some post-war aspects where the buildings are either being scraped or they're being modified inappropriately so that they don't fit the context of the neighborhood. And so what the pattern books allow for is, again, realizing that these areas have to grow in density, these areas have to grow from a standpoint of populations are moving in, and not only that, but family sizes are moving up in these areas. And so how do we modify these particular homes so that people can live in there, they can grow in there, they can keep their existence there, whether they have more kids or whether they having their mother-in-law come in and living there or working there, and do it in a way that's contextual to that neighborhood, so that not only is the purpose of the buildings themselves being satisfied, but also the neighborhood is being kept whole. So we have some pattern books. One of our most recent one, and I actually have a copy right here. I did not author this, so this is not like a book tour where I'm trying to sell my book. But Crisanta Park is one of our most recent pattern books that we did. This one was, I'm not going to say it was easy. This was a heck of an effort to be able to do this, and there was a number of partners that were involved, including at the University of Colorado, Denver, and their Center of Preservation and National Trust. But Crisanta Park, if you don't know, it's a wonderful neighborhood down in southeast Denver. And it's a neighborhood that's built of basically 5 different model homes that were done mid-century. And one of the big highlights of these is that they're low-slung ranch-type buildings, and some of the add-ons were popping up the top so they would be unrecognizable. And the neighborhood was a little bit up in arms about that. And so this pattern book, what it did is it allowed some of the add-ons and other things to be laid out in a very graphic form so that everybody can see what is available and possible. Now, this was not a historic district when it was done. It has now since had a conservation overlay in addition to the pattern book to even more make sure that the patterns of homes there are something that is pleasing for the neighborhood and is also able to grow. And what was interesting about the conservation overlay, in addition to the pattern book, is that there were some tools that were involved in that overlay that allowed for the buildings to be built outside of what zoning would allow, but to fit the historic context of the area. So it was something that I think was a wonderful way to be able to get what everybody wants and fit within the pattern of what the neighbors wanted as well. So we've also done these for pre-World War II homes up in the Arvada area, post-World War II in Arvada, as well as post-World War II homes in Littleton. So if this is something that your neighborhood is interested in, we're happy to have conversations about both conservation overlays and pattern books so that development going forward can meet some of the needs that those neighbors have. I do have to say, though, on conservation overlay, it can be a wonderful tool like a Crisanta Park, because basically what it was stating is that the type and shape and mass of your home is going to look very much like what is already there. It does not deny demolitions, though. And so you can demolish a house, but what the conservation overlay is saying is that the new property that's going inside that basically has to look very much like what is already there. So it disincentivizes demolition. In some other areas where you might not have as uniform a house type, conservation overlays can be very difficult to work with, because basically what you're doing is a zoning tool for that area to say that this is the type of home, we're going to do porches or setbacks in this particular type of way. But let's say some neighborhoods that are very eclectic, that's hard to say what is that particular. Some of the character of the eclecticism that's there is very hard to put in a black and white zoning context. And that's where we say that historic district is probably your better route if you're going for some of the, that type of a positive aspect of keeping the character of your neighborhood.
I think something to add to that conversation, though, is I remember in the early 2000s when nobody really noticed Crisanta Park. Remember that? Like the Home Depot doors, and nobody really cared about it. And probably even in the early 50s when they built those houses, people were going, they were used to brick ranches, or, so our kind of evolution of thinking is changing, and then sometimes it comes back into style, and sometimes they tear it down. So I think that's a really kind of powerful conversation for the old Denver, the new Denver, and what transpires kind of in between that. Is Crisanta Park is a great example of we wanted it, we didn't want it, then we wanted it again. And I think that's really kind of like a powerful conversation that we should all be having. Like, what does this all look like, and what's going to be accepted now may not be accepted later.
Awesome. I think something that really came clear to me as you were talking about the conservation overlay, and is also true about the design overlay when you want to have elements in new, is that it doesn't preserve and doesn't stop demolitions. And so I think it's important to understand that we have tools like historic preservation tools that stop demolition, and we have some on the other end that allow for design elements but don't change. They don't change the use and right of the property owner to be able to do that. The last one is number 5 of all the tools that were listed here in Blueprint Denver, and that's zoning code and form standards. I think we've heard a lot about this today, whether it's how big and the mass of your building could be, where is the front facing, how close to the sidewalk it is one that came up a lot. It gave rise to the conversation around the slot homes. And it probably gave some rise to what you talk about with Denver Fugly. And so I'm curious as to just your thoughts about form-based zoning and how Denver Fugly is playing a part in that conversation.
Well, I mean, probably Denver Fugly started two directions. I lived in Jefferson Park starting in 2004, and maybe when the market kind of started recovering in 2012, they just started ripping everything down. I don't think we were oblivious early on because it was all zoned R3, so the new zoning, that the 2010 rewrite didn't really change our minds about what was going to happen in Jefferson Park. It just ended up being maybe faster or less attractive than we had expected. I think the other thing that really probably kind of gave rise to Denver Fugly was a project at Park Avenue and Glenarm. I was dropping my daughter off one day, and the words, that thing is effing ugly, came out of my mouth, and it kind of looked like a Soviet-style tan or blue and gray building. And so that really kind of was the launch of me having a conversation first about my neighborhood. Like, my neighborhood was changing, and was there anything I could do about it? We'd had some earlier zoning fights about large apartment buildings, and then trying to just think about what our neighborhood was going to look like. So when the slot homes kind of started being invented, I guess, with a kind of a loophole in the zone code where kind of an apartment form was being built on small lots, that kind of was like an impetus for just is this the best thing to have in our neighborhood? And I think that's what we all have to ask, what these neighborhoods are going to evolve. I was at a meeting the other night, and a guy was talking about how cities form, and there's a group, and these are his interpretations, not necessarily mine, but there are people over 50 who want their neighborhoods to stay the same, and then everybody under 50 are like, hey, this is kind of exciting, I'm really glad it's like this. So I don't know where the balance is in that. Our city is going to evolve, and cities that don't evolve kind of, I think of Gary, Indiana, or Detroit. So how do we embrace the new and kind of honor the past? Those are the two things that I've always been trying to get to with Denver Fugly.
Brad, I'd be interested in just asking the audience a question of how many of you think you understand what form-based zoning means? That's just a few hands have gone up, and I don't mean any criticism of you, but I would say that most people that think they do don't. And I would be interested if Sarah could maybe take a minute, and I ask this of every city official that's in planning that I happen to be have the opportunity to talk to this about what they think form-based zoning is, because it's not a common method of zoning across the country. It's becoming more common. It's extraordinarily flexible, which then yields extraordinarily difficult implementation on the other side of it. But I'm always interested to hear from a planner what their perception is of Denver being a form-based zoning city. It took place in 2010, and just to give you a little bit of historical perspective, because we're only dealing, even though it took place in 2000 when we changed the zoning in Denver, remember that happened right at the lip of the real estate downturn. So nobody had to live with what was done for 2 or 3 or 4 years. It wasn't really seriously until about 2014 that redevelopment started and the wave started, and then of course in Denver it was a tidal wave, and all of a sudden the city, they're all good people in planning department, they try hard, but this city was overwhelmed by 2 things. One, the sheer maximum amount of development being proposed, and a brand new code that no one had any real time to work through. So that's why you see some of these problems like slot housing and other things develop. But I think maybe just an overview from the city of what do they think it means to be a form-based zoning city in terms of planning for the future?
Sure. Yeah, I'd be happy to talk about that. So I think the best way to start is to go back in time to what the zoning code was before it was form-based, right? So we had a very traditional zoning code that most cities in the United States would have had at the time, and many still do today. In planning school, you call it Euclidian zoning because that's based on a historic Supreme Court case where Euclid was one of the parties to the case that basically established the legal right to even do zoning. But the idea of that kind of very traditional zoning that started way back in big cities like New York, 1920s-ish, but in Denver was really 1950s that we were writing the code we had for so many years, was very based on uses. And it developed out of an era, the idea of zoning really was about protecting residential areas was a huge thing because before there was zoning, there wasn't anything to necessarily keep industrial uses from not being developed immediately next to a residential neighborhood. And so the idea that developed, it was also very connected to being post-World War II and thinking about the automobile and a future country where we would drive everywhere and not need to walk anywhere, was we should separate our land uses. So we should make sure industrial areas are separate and really far away from residential, and we should separate commercial from residential. So you have an exclusively residential area, and then you get in your car and you drive to work. And then you get in your car and you drive to where the shopping district is, and then you get in your car and you drive back to your residential area. It was very much focused on the use that was happening on the land and keeping those uses separated. And that was the foundation of the code. Now, it was written in the 1950s, and we were still using it well into the 2000s, so it had definitely been amended and evolved, but the core of it was still that foundation. And it was actually preventing us from realizing what we were hearing the community liked, which is our historic areas, basically, which is where residential and office are often together. And your shopping places are in walking distance or biking distance, or if you still might use your car, but you don't have to drive 20 minutes there. And they're all connected by easy to get to places on a grid of streets. A lot of the Euclidian zoning, was from an era when we built our more suburban type neighborhoods. It's not just that things are separated, it's that you might actually be just 20 feet from the back of a commercial district that has your grocery store, but because of the way that the neighborhood's designed, you're at the end of a cul-de-sac, you actually have to go out your cul-de-sac to a local street, then get on Collector Street, then get an arterial, turn down the next arterial, then the next one, and then you're at the grocery store. So it just took you 10 minutes to get to something that was actually 20 feet away. And that's in big contrast to a more urban setting where you have a grid of streets and alleys and everything's kind of easily connected. So the code felt very broken based on what the community said that they wanted Denver to be. It was not really aligning with so many of what our neighborhoods were and the kind of development that we wanted. And I agree with you that there's been some unintended outcomes from the zoning code, but I would also emphasize that if we hadn't updated the code in 2010 and the massive redevelopment that happened with the big economic boom as we came out of the recession would have also led to a lot of bad design outcomes. So, and much more so than I think we've experienced under the form-based code, because what led us to finally getting to what we think form-based is, it's a shift away from thinking about everything just by land use. It's also thinking about what do the buildings look like. So it's very new idea in form-based zoning to address things like how close is the building to the street? Are you allowed to have parking between the building and the street? Are you required to have transparency on the ground floor so that when people walk by, there's windows to look through or glass doors to look through? What's the height of the building? A lot of the old code zoning was based on floor area ratio, which gives you a max development area based on the size of your lot. But you can kind of allocate it however you want. So you might end up with a really tall, skinny building or a short kind of building that's spread out. So one of the big tenets of the form-based code is a little more predictability in the building form and setting a maximum height that's in stories. So those are some of the things that make Denver's code form-based. I do want to emphasize, though, we don't have a traditional form-based code. A true form-based code focuses on form exclusively and has very little regulation about land use. So the philosophy behind that is kind of like after all of the bad outcomes of the Euclidian zoning, where you saw a lot of like if you picture a traditional like 1950s and 1980s strip area in Denver where you have one-story buildings way back from the street, parking lots in front, no landscaping. The buildings tend to have very little architectural quality. That was what the code was producing. And in kind of reaction to that, some communities developed form-based codes that were like, it doesn't matter as much what the use is. We want mixed use. We want everything kind of mixed together. So as long as you get the form right, does it really matter that much what's happening in the building? And so Denver really has a lot of planners would call a hybrid code because it does still matter what's happening in the building too, right? The uses are important as well. And I think a lot of people in this room are familiar with our code. It still has a lot of regulation in it about uses. It did open up uses to be more flexible and blend them in areas where it's appropriate. So along corridors and in centers, it's much more common now to be able to put residential and commercial together when for a long time the old code wouldn't have let you do that. So that's, in Denver anyway, that's really what our form-based code is about.
Let me add this because, thank you, Sarah. So we have two elements in Denver that are critical. One is we call it, you always say it's form-based zoning, but it really is, it truly is a hybrid. We have Euclidean use control and we have form control, which lends itself to design review, if that didn't readily jump to mind. It lends itself to an imposition of that kind of paradigm at some level. There's a third aspect that if you're going to be reviewing any aspect of what's happening in Denver that you need to have in mind. It's the third leg of the planning stool in Denver. It's what we call zone lots. It's another concept that is almost unique to Denver. I don't, frankly, know of another major metropolitan area that uses it. And the reason I bring it up is that you see we saw them today, you see all these maps and plans, and they all show these nice little neighborhoods, and they all have little lots and blocks. And the lot lines are around the blocks. And you think, oh, well, that's where you put a house, and that's where you put a house, or that's where you put a building. That's irrelevant in Denver for planning purposes. All those subdivision lines that you see on the maps are irrelevant for planning purposes. All that's important in Denver is that you own the property that you're applying to the city for a permit to develop. You may combine one of your lot by itself and say, I want to build a residence here. Someone may combine two lots owned by different people and say, we want on this zone lot, put two residences, a residence and another type of structure. What the city does is when you do a land use application, you draw the boundaries. You have to have the ownership of all the property within those boundaries on the application process. But then the city says, okay, however many lots you encompass, or even portions of different lots you encompass, as long as they're contiguous, we're going to look at that parcel and what you want to do on that parcel in the application of our code and our planning process. So you can just imagine the flexibility with that it gives to the city and it gives to us. But it also means that when you're looking at these maps, just because you see 20 lots on a residential block doesn't mean necessarily that that's what's going to be there, or that our code will mandate that, or somebody wouldn't come in and say our land use application is to use those 20 blocks for one multifamily structure or multi-use structure or something else. So just keep in mind that not only do we have this extraordinary flexibility under our zoning code, but then in the way we actually look at land use demarcation, we even have further flexibility. And that really impacts the planning process.
I just want to clarify that it is true that we have these zone lots and they're flexible, but the majority of the zone lots in Denver do align with the traditional parcel lines, and we do have things in the form-based code like minimum lot size that would not allow you to just take an area that has 20 lots and say, oh, let's all come together and combine them and build multi-unit. You wouldn't be able to do that through the zone lot. So it may not be quite as flexible as you were describing. I just want to be clear.
That's the difference between the government and the attorneys.
That's pretty funny. So we made our way through all these design tools that are outlined here in Blueprint Denver. And if, for those at home or in the audience, page 69 of the recommendations of the draft is a place where you can turn to see these. So the first goal is to make sure these tools are accessible to the community. And I'm just curious, from a historic Denver process, from a landmark commission process, from a Denver Fugly, how do we go about making people know about these and then participate in them? And I think historic preservation is a good place to start because it's purely applicant driven as it exists now. And so how do you get those tools into the arms of the people in the right amount of time with the burden on the community rather than on the city?
Well, I can start with that a little bit in terms of, obviously, neighborhood involvement for any of these things is paramount. Although I would have to add, I went to probably about every zoning meeting around the city in 2010. And, I come from architecture. I'm interested in land use. I'm interested in urban planning. And it drove me mad. Because when you're talking about zoning and numbers and all of these different kinds of things, it just gets mind-numbing. So it was interesting in 2010. And I think it's an interesting point that has been brought up about the fact that we didn't see the results of a lot of these things and these changes for a couple of years because I think the city actually did a good job of getting out and getting people to try to be involved, but it was such a long process and it just drives people down to the point where numbers on a sheet mean nothing until that construction starts to happen. And when that construction starts to happen, it becomes real, and it becomes, real to everybody out there. I mean, I always want people to be involved in urban planning, and they can go to our website. I know they can go to the city's website and be involved in all of the public processes, but it is very difficult. But it is, I have to say, it is still imperative. It's still, because as Historic Denver, I'm at a lot of these meetings, and I will give my opinions on land use and things like that. I try to come a little bit from the architecture background, much more even than the preservation background. But if I have Historic Denver and I have it right here in my name tag, everybody knows what my bias is. So it is interesting, like when you're talking in boards and I'm speaking, they sort of go, yeah, we know your spiel. But when neighbors come, and when neighbors are either outraged or interested or engaged, that's when things start to happen. And that's the only way that things start to happen, is when neighbors, are engaged with their elected officials, with the city staff, and really it does start with giving us a call and with your council person a call and all of those items. I would encourage that with Blueprint Denver and all of the other things that are really important. When you're planning geeks and like many of us are, looking at these things is something that we're going to do anyway. But a lot of people don't want to do that. But then you're having to live with whatever is out there for the next 5, 10, or in the situation of our last zoning before the 2010, maybe 50 years of the same exact kind of way. And we lost a lot of buildings, and we saw a lot of surface parking lots and other things like that as a part of the old zoning. There are definitely problems with the new form-based or hybrid. There are many good things about it as well, but it is one of those where we need neighborhood engagement. And one of the big things that I think that Historic Denver has been pushing for in terms of Blueprint Denver has been for more understanding and more emphasis on the contextual aspects of Blueprint Denver and how our city builds. But we can't do this in a vacuum from a standpoint of cities are dynamic, cities are very interesting places, so let's not treat them like just blank slates that just say, let's just put a bunch of buildings that are this particular size. We need things that understand where those buildings are now and how those new buildings can go in there. They don't have to be the same exact size, but they need to understand and relate to what is already there.
I think the one thing that add to your list of things that citizens need to be, and it's also informed. Like, how does this process work? Mm-hmm. You know, I can come at something completely half-cocked, and it doesn't necessarily, like, being informed is like another key component. I think what Denver Fugly's managed to do is at least get people aware of, like, hey, what is good and bad? Like, just that kind of distinction, and then, you know, I think people kind of come into it like not knowing, and then once they start realizing that there's another kind of layer of conversation, I think that's an important part of this whole thing. Is like, you know, historic Denver in 50 years is going to have to defend what's being built today. And that's just the truth. So how do we get the historians like to realize, like, hey, you've got as much influence on what was built as what's going to be built, and because we're going to have to defend that in the future. And so I think that's such. And we were on a selection thing today, and we talked a lot about how context is critical to this whole thing. Like, do we want this here? Or do we want this here? And then try to raise the bar through engagement, through conversation, and try to force these attorneys and the developers to do better stuff at the same time. So all those things kind of are it's interrelated, but it comes from being informed. Like, that's like the key thing that I think.
Well, yes, and from a standpoint, the reason I'm going to all these meetings is not necessarily so that I'm out there yelling about it, because I'm already going to be out there yelling about it, but it's so that we can show things on our website, we can show things in our newsletter, and, you know, I would encourage everybody, you know, to come to our website at historicdenver.org or come to our forums. We have the RE Denver forums that are out there. To talk about design, because what we're trying to do is gathering in as much information that the city's willing to give, that everybody is willing to give when it comes to these things, and drill them down a little bit so that they're palatable to our membership and to the public. And so, you know, we're trying to educate as much as we possibly can and let you make the decision and really decide, you know, what you want to do in those neighborhoods.
Can I add something on? It just hasn't been touched on. Since I worked on that goal that's in Blueprint Denver that started this, I just want to really also point out that the point there about equitable is, you know, all this is so worthy and so true that it's so hard to get your mind around this very complex zoning code and understanding it all. Now imagine that you're doing that and English isn't your first language. Or you are trying to make your neighborhood better, but you're working 3 jobs and taking care of 2 kids on your own. Like, there's a big demographic inequitable outcome right now in terms of who's getting the conservation overlays and pattern books and things like that. It makes sense because it's largely driven by the community, because the city doesn't have the resources to go out and proactively do it ourselves. It's largely the neighborhoods that have resources and are able to have the time, and sometimes a lot of what it is they also have people living in the neighborhood that are also architects and design professionals who can come together and do this. So part of that goal too, I want to be clear, is that we would really like to use Blueprint Denver as a foundation to hopefully get more resources and staff so we can provide some more education for everybody, because it's complex for everyone, but especially also hopefully try and encourage more participation in neighborhoods that don't have as many resources.
I would just add that I think you know, CPD in general, this Blueprint Denver is doing a great job. Dana Crawford asked earlier if INC was involved with the Blueprint. Yes, we are involved with it. Joe Noble, who is our transportation co-chair, he is the chair of the Blueprint. I sit on it, and so does the person I preceded, Margie Valdez. But that being said, this equitable conversation I think has come up so much, especially when we got feedback that the people who are participating even in this planning process weren't represented. And I think the city's responded in a lot of ways. I just sat through a couple-day-long training where they brought in somebody to talk about equity and how do we evaluate these tools and this plan to it. And I think the thing that really became clear is how are we going to move to the implementation process? Some of the things that I heard come out of it is support historic Denver. Another one that I heard out of it was we're going to need more staff dollars, which means around budget cycle we have to be having this conversation about what we want, which is right now. But every year they get the opportunity to have that conversation. So I just want to point those out. Further on in some of these goals, we started talking about streetscape. We were talking about streetscape and the streetscape components. We had Adrian Brown here talking about different ways that we could do it. You mentioned a little bit, Sarah, about the front windows and people being able to see inside. Could you just maybe touch a little bit on where the city's going with, number 4 with the pedestrian environment? I think is it 6 is the built environment. I think in general, INC and zoning and planning have taken a position that the city is not doing enough on the public health realm, and we believe that streetscapes is a tool for that. And so supporting and having that conversation during the review process is probably a good place to focus on number 6.
Yeah, I think it's a great point, and obviously when we talk about the quality that we're going for, there's the edge of the building that you see from the public realm, but it's still technically private property. And that's so important. But then there's also the entire public realm that is in the literal public realm and is not private property. And right now, the way that the city is set up in terms of regulation is that that's very much under the jurisdiction of Public Works. And so there's a lot of cooperation and partnership that's gone into the vision for streetscapes that's in Blueprint Denver that extends into other Denverite plans like the comprehensive plan as well as game plan. Because parks, that's where the city forester lives. And so all of the trees that are in the public right-of-way fall under that department. All the rules about how the street's actually designed fall within Public Works. CPD, my department, Community Planning and Development, contributes a lot because we're the ones controlling the private property through zoning and design standards and guidelines and what that edge with the building looks like, and whether there's outdoor seating there and all those kinds of things. And then you also have other players that are really important, like the fire department deciding how big lanes need to be and whether there can be on-street parking that really impacts the street. And so our vision is to recognize the public realm, as Ian in particular mentioned health. I think health is a big one. It relates to health in so many ways. Two really that off the top of my mind are advancing and promoting more physical activity. If you have an attractive public realm and great streetscaping, you're much more likely to want to walk or ride your bike. But there's also a lot of climate benefits that relate to health as well that come from having great streetscaping. You can integrate water quality very well into good streetscaping and get that benefit. And then trees themselves and just any vegetation are providing shade, reducing the urban heat island. Those have really big benefits for the city as a whole when it comes to our climate impact as well as the quality of the air we breathe and the water that we have in the city. And obviously we have a lot of room to improve in Denver right now when it comes to creating better streetscapes and a higher quality public realm. So there are a lot of recommendations in Blueprint Denver. A lot of those are actually in the quality of life infrastructure chapter, not just in the design quality, which is a little more focused on private realm, about how we need to basically get all those people I just mentioned at the city that influence the public realm to kind of comprehensively update all of the rules and regulations that influence the design of streets. That would largely be when private development's coming in and what they're required to build in the right-of-way right in front of them. But it would also include when the city does larger capital projects and is designing a new road or they're making a big change. And we'd really like to do that together across all the departments so that there can be that coordination and understanding of the multiple purposes that the public realm is serving and should do a better job serving.
I think just before we answer your question, I want you to note that we're changing from a people in car focus. I mean, what she just said, I think with Blueprint Denver is we're talking about people focus in the public realm rather than people in cars focus, and I think that is such a critical, manifold foundational change that our cities are going to go through, is that it's not car focused anymore, and that's something that has a realm change on everything. So just keep that in mind.
I'd also like to just add in, I think that there's an opportunity with Blueprint Denver and with the city to take advantage of some of the aspects of the public realm that we already have from a standpoint of the historic parks and parkways and how we link those into new development. We have some of our most beautiful spaces are done from the City Beautiful movement, Saco de Boer, and all these wonderful design spaces that we have. But there are several that are underutilized and several that are sort of islands amongst themselves and that need to link up with the new development and the new growth, and that's something I think should be stressed.
And it also,
I'll let Amy, let's let Amy go. Go ahead, Amy.
I just wanted to say it also goes back to the design review. So there's one of the primary reasons that the Landmark Commission exists is so that we can do that design review so that we can make sure that what is visible from the street is in character with the neighborhood and is of a design that is going to be beneficial to our city. And so it is the neighbors who is the community who gets together and makes creates these districts. It's not the commission. It's not the planning office that comes and says, "Oh, we think this neighborhood should be historic." It's you all. It's the residents who want to maintain that look and that design in your neighborhood. And so, if there is a certain feel or look to your neighborhood that you want to have, then that's where the design review comes in, and so that's very much a part of it as well.
Yeah, I think this is a point where you need to hear a contrarian view. And that is that it's something that Dana Crawford said, the popular idea is not necessarily the best idea. Right now, the popular driving mantra of urban planning and urban education is density. And it's wrong-headed. It isn't that density isn't important. It doesn't mean that we don't recognize that a lot of people are going to move to Denver in the Front Range and we have to accommodate them. What it does mean, however, is that every discussion you have about quality of life should not start with posing density against sprawl. Because in fact, Denver's landlocked. We're a small community in terms of geography. So we don't have a sprawl issue. That's a metro issue. On a metro issue, ultimately, we could have urbanization from at least Fort Collins to Colorado Springs or beyond. It's really a different conversation than what we're looking at for our lives in Denver right now. And what I would posit we need more focus on from the urban planning arena, the quality of life should be the apex of the decision-making process, not density. And it's really easy to say, oh, density is driven by developers, and it's all the dollar, and it's all money, and it's more tax dollars and revenue in the city, and the city wants more money and more power and more people. That's really just avoiding the hard questions. Density is a consequence, not a goal. And in dealing with how we get to that consequence, the real discussions have to be the hard ones. And they're not just objective geographic form issues of what does our building look like and how many windows does it have and what's the streetscape on the front. It's much more individual ideas. So what is it about Denver that we like? We heard Dennis Gallagher talk about the walkability of older neighborhoods because they have sidewalks with boulevards between the sidewalk and the street, and we have grass, and we have trees. Well, that needs to be higher up on the scale of what's important. Then do we crowd all our, how small of a, can we force people to be into a small unit that has to touch each other and have no air between it? And we love the sun. We have 300 days of sunshine in Colorado. How does that figure into wanting townhomes on every block or needing 30-story apartment buildings instead of 10 or 20? Those are the hard decisions. In public arenas, isn't the public entitled to continue to have public parks and public spaces that they enjoy taking their children to, that they aren't dissuaded from taking them by the activities, whether they be drug activities or whatever are going on in those parks? How do we draw that balance? We know we've seen over the last year how we've tried to address it on 16th Street Mall, somewhat effectively, somewhat not. But to my mind, what I want to see in the urban planning environment is let's focus on those human issues. Let's not try to drive human behavior by our form. So, for example, the other thing you always hear about urban planning is Let's get rid of all the cars. Well, you know what? People are not going to walk to the mountains. People are not going to ride their bikes to the ski areas. This is Colorado. We are an outdoor environment people. That means because of so much of our land is owned by the federal government or the state and it's open to recreation, there are not going to be trains to those places. There are not going to be bus lines to those places. So let's not choke down everything. And what's the fulcrum of that point? It's when you get from the standpoint of urban planning being responsive to the needs of the community and instead wanting to be an imposition of governmental control on the life of the community. And by this, my primary example is, let's force congestion so we make people walk and ride bikes. That's absolutely wrong-headed. The proper planning needs to take into account that the world is changing. All the cars aren't as polluting as they used to be. Maybe we're going to have self-driving cars. Maybe we're going to have electric cars. We're going to have more trains. We're going to have more buses. Let's not single out one mode of transportation and make that our fulcrum of our urban planning.
But we've singled it out for 60 years, so now it's time for the people to take the streets back.
We accommodated it. You know, people are not... The best example of this is just watch what... I live near Cherry Creek. Watch what happens when you create an urban density of affluent means without parking and think that those people are going to walk, and no increase in public transit. And so all I'm saying is, I'm not saying you don't reduce.
It's just a change of priorities, right? I'm
Yeah.
not, and I'm not anti-car. And Cherry Creek, the only in the 2017 census, the only community in Denver that's increased walking and biking. The only one. The rest is cars have gone up. So,
just to come in here as a moderator, we are talking about design, not just transportation planning. But I do think Cherry Creek's a good example because they have design standards there. I did want to talk to you, Terry, about this, and I think probably Sarah, that I think one of the questions that was posed to us is that this high-quality streetscape in some places is required, like a mandate. The government comes in heavy-handed. And here you are representing, as an attorney who represents private interests typically who don't want to spend that money, but yet your personal values elevate the streetscape. And so,
it's really not true. I'm going to defend developers here. It is not true that quality developers don't want to spend the money. Okay, that is just not accurate. If you want one of the best examples I know of that I personally worked on and represented, look at the Amaranth Apartments that would be first infill apartment project in the Cheeseman Park area in 25 years, built immediately north of Botanic Gardens. In building that project, we have quality clients. We worked with Chun, we worked with the Neighborhood Association, we worked with the Historic District. We've got universal accolades for participation. Look at the design of the building, the setback. Look at the streetscape. Look at how it fits into a neighborhood that's immediately adjacent to both Botanic Gardens and the surrounding community, which is both historic and urban. So there are developers out there that can and will do quality work. So it's not just, it's partially a function. It's partially a function of mandates. It's more a function of a much broader principle of how you want your city to look. And it starts at the urban planning level because that's where the government is really setting the control.
And what I'm trying to say is not that it can't be done right, Terry, or that there aren't developers who have done it right. But what we have seen is a lot of recommended streetscape improvements that have fallen short in this private-public realm where they come together. And I think that's kind of the impetus, right, Sarah, for why that is in here as a part of the plan is that, well, why is it, though, that our city attorney doesn't seem to think that we can mandate even higher standards and we're more in a place of recommending the public sphere to be better than it is?
So I just want to clarify we can mandate. That's not what the city attorney's saying. They're saying that CPD, Community Planning and Development, which is largely regulating private realm, is not the agency or department that can then enforce what happens in the public right of way. So I think what you might be picking up on is you've probably heard CPD writes a lot of design standards and guidelines for different communities. We've done most recently, like Arapahoe Square is a great example, and it came up in Cherry Creek too as well for their design standards and guidelines. When you get people, understandably, it's about design. They want to have design standards and guidelines that don't just address the design of the building and the site, but also address the streetscape and the sidewalk environment that's in front of the building. And unless the forester, if you want street trees included, and Public Works sign off on the rules and regulations as theirs as well that they'll enforce, CPD doesn't have the authority. So we can encourage things in the right-of-way. We can write a lot of guidelines as opposed to standards. So standards tend to be shall and things that you have to do. Guidelines are things you're encouraged to do. So a lot of our recent design standards and guidelines, we don't want to just ignore the public realm and not have what we want in there, but it'll be a lot of guidelines because ultimately the enforcement of those would be by the department in charge of the right-of-way.
Okay. We're going to go to questions in here just a second. Our audio engineer is going to get a stand set up over here just so we can make sure we get the questions on audio. We didn't have that before for the others. And while that's happening, I just would like to go down the line really, really quickly. If there is one building you could landmark today, just any building, which would it be?
I think there are several right on this campus we could just do right now. There's the administration building is one that's not locally landmarked. This is a National Register property, but this is definitely a wonderful campus for this, not only for this part of the city, but for this city as a whole. And as we can see from our top step perch that we're here over the front range. This is seen from a really long ways away, and I know we've had the recent sale of this property, and there's going to be a change in use, but at Historic Denver, we've heard a lot about, from all over the city, about these properties on this campus, so this would be a good place to start, I think.
Well, I would have said about the same thing about this. I think this campus needs to be landmarked because since it did just sell, so we are going to have a lot of new buildings built here, and since there is no design review over this campus, it's going to be anything goes. So if this campus did have at least some of the buildings landmarked, and then at least we would get that design review over it. But the other things I'm worried about are some of the things, for example, one that is I'm particularly concerned about is a mansion up at 17th and Grant that is been for sale, that is the last remaining building in that area that predates the state capitol. It was a Frank Edbrook building, one of his last remaining houses, and it's being swallowed up by an area that is as downtown moves into the Capitol Hill area. So that's one that I'm particularly concerned about as well, and it is really one of the finest 1880s buildings we have left in Denver. So that's the other one I'm concerned about.
This is hard. There's so many great buildings, but I think I'll go with, I don't even know what the name of the building is, but it's a little, I think it's an old like steam engine plant that's on 13th and Cherokee. It faces Cherokee in the Golden Triangle area. It's
the Cherokee Boiler.
The Cherokee Boiler, is that what it is? Cherokee Boiler House. That's the one. It's a beautiful building, and would hate to see anything ever happen to it.
I'm going to follow up with this one on something else that Dana Crawford acknowledged, and that is preservation never ends. The biggest fight we're going to have in the next year in Denver on preservation is to preserve Larimer Square. And it's facing a severe threat. It's recently been placed on the most endangered list of historic places. If we permit Larimer Square to be torn asunder or built over, either through manipulation or amendment of Denver Landmarks Code, it will be a travesty. So all of our efforts, at the very apex of our efforts in preservation, need to be preserving that gem, that jewel that we have in Larimer Square.
I'm going to go the opposite route. I'm going to like the most likely to be torn down next list. Or maybe one that should be torn down. I think you'll remember the Anderson House. This is my most fugly house in Denver, so I'm going to, the least landmarkable. Remember where the Anderson House is? If you get a chance, it's on Elliott between 24th and 23rd in Jefferson Park. It is the ugliest building in Denver that they put up where the Anderson House was. So that is my answer to your question.
Well, I was thinking
there's,
about
there's a lot more, but that is by far and then the ugliest one in Denver.
I couldn't ask for anything less for you to be contrary to the question that we asked. I couldn't agree more. I think this campus is an amazing place. I think that's part of why we hosted it. I do believe that we need to rally to protect Larimer number 1. For me, I just want to see more districts be grown out in other parts of the city. And there was a reason why I called out how we're going to make sure this equitably happens. I think the housing pressures are moving to West Denver, and I'm from West Denver, and I think there's a lot of culture there to be saved. And so I really hope to see that in the future. That being said, we're going to move to Q&A from the community, and we have a mic here, so just come and start a queue, and you'll get your opportunity. We have a hard stop at 2, so we have about 16 minutes for questions. So questions, please, not just comments.
I would like to know what is the difference between the comprehensive plan, Blueprint Denver, Denver Right, and all these 5 different things are being addressed under that 257-page book that we're all supposed to read in 3 months and comment on.
I think I might just say a little bit, and then Sarah. I mean, it's the comprehensive plan, the highest level plan, which I think we've had a conversation about elevating public health, demanding more elements than just 6. I mean, the fact that climate change isn't there is one that's really important to us. And I think as you go down the plans that you're mentioning, the game plan, which is parks, Blueprint, which is this, the transportation, Denver Moves, they all are plans that serve underneath that comprehensive plan, and they all refer to each other. I mean, is that a fair answer?
Yeah, I think that's a great description.
I have something that's 147 pages long. It's called Denver Right. What is that covering? Is it covering the comprehensive plan, or what is it?
Yeah, so I'll sure. Denver Right itself is not a thing. It's a process. It's the name for the process that we engaged the community over the past 2 years to draft 5 different plans. So all the plans have a Denver Right logo on them because they are all part of Denver Right that are out for public review right now. But there isn't a document that's called Denver Right. It was a name because Parks and Rec was going to do game plan, and my department was going to do Blueprint Denver and the comprehensive plan, and Public Works was going to do the transit plan. And all those things are interrelated. We were going to be coordinating internally like crazy because of all the overlap, and we realized that the community, they don't necessarily always care about what I want to talk about the future of Denver, and which plan it lives in or which department it lives in is less important for some anyway, and they want to be able to just kind of clearly understand what are the big issues and how do I give input. So it led to a common name, a common website. There's still a different page for each plan, but they're all at the Denver Right website. So Denver Right is an umbrella to help bring these plans together and show how they're interrelated and show that we're working together on all of them.
Now, Elizabeth, come on.
can start by answering that since I work for the city. I think, honestly, when you ask me that question, the question I want to ask is, I want the communities to tell us what could the city do better to help, right? We have some ideas. We've looked at across the country at what are cities trying to do. I think some of the ideas that we think sound good are looking at ways to provide stipends and other resources to recognize that certain communities don't have as much resource, and they need help to even just find the time to get educated and participate. But this is a really challenging topic, right? And I think we need creative solution. We need to hear from the communities themselves that need this resource. What could the city do that would help the most?
I think you're right on all of the fact that there need to be tools in place for the neighborhood to be able to use for those areas. This is a very difficult thing because we have protections in place. I was talking about our historic districts being about 5% of the city's built environment. Right now, if you look at a map of those protected buildings, they pretty much go from the northwest to the southeast. And it's usually more in the affluent areas because that's, again, where we have those neighbors with the tools already. Historic Denver has been trying to do over the last 4 years, we have an action fund that we're trying to get in for those more neighborhoods that don't have the investment or don't have the tools for themselves, and they can come, and if they have community-wide ideas, these do not have to be in historic districts or involve historic buildings. These can just be community-wide plans about trying to better those areas, obviously dealing with historic eligible properties, but not necessarily designated properties. So that's something that we encourage, and we have between $5,000 and $10,000 to get that going. So that can be a conversation. I mean, I have been, as AE, you can, I've been involved in a number of the meetings, and there's just a lot of talking about what is possible. I've been up there for at least 7 or so years, talking through the I-70 situation, through the National Western Stock Show situation, all of these things in the Globeville area, Swansea neighborhood. And I can tell you that it's been a difficult conversation for me to have from a protective standpoint of what can we protect in these neighborhoods, because the priorities have not necessarily been about that yet. And it's been about, like, we need improvements, we need infrastructure, we need grocery stores, we need all of these different things, which are hugely important. One of those things that I think you're pointing out, though, is that, and what I've been trying to stress, is that it's too late once the developers come in and they already are grabbing up land, because then you're dealing with just pieces of properties that are left. There needs to be that comprehensive planning and ideas before that happens. We can still have those conversations in those neighborhoods and many neighborhoods here in Southwest Denver, as many other areas in Denver, but historic Denver especially can't come in and save the day when a developer has already, has the property in place. But you also mentioned Discover Denver, and that's a huge effort to get a little bit ahead of the game. It's not necessarily to, make a bunch of districts or designate a bunch of properties. It's really just to know what we have. Discover Denver is the first comprehensive survey that we've ever done. in Denver, and that's done in partnership with the city of Denver. And it's a long process, though. And so when we started in Globeville, this is really in our infancy. We're very much along now, and we're going to start seeing some results of that. And I hope to give you better news in the future about other places that, when things start to change, when city policies start to be proposed in certain areas, we're going to have a lot better idea of what is actually there on the ground, so that conversation can go a lot quicker. It can involve the neighbors much quicker, and the places that the neighborhood values will be saved. Not in every case, of course, but and that we'll be able to move forward. We're not quite there yet, but that's something that we're continually striving for.
If I could just add one other thing that crossed my mind, and that's that there's been this conversation about the general development planning being taken away from the developers being the ones driving that, to the city being the real driver around the community input there. So if you take this campus, for example, a city-driven process with historic buildings and design elements being driven all at the same time, there's opportunity to protect and also build around it in the same character.
And I would just say that, it's obviously I come from it from historic Denver, but it's in that planning process, it's not just the historic buildings but it is the valuable buildings,
yes.
And that's the thing. It doesn't have to be that they're designated. It means that they're valued to the neighborhood. And this is something that we don't want to see. You don't want to throw out the baby with the bathwater. You want to have a great plan, but you want to take the value that's already there and build upon it. You don't want to erase that.
Yeah, the adaptive reuse, I think Terry
and
touched on.
and that's something really important in the general development plan, because we've had to deal with this on many situations where those buildings aren't considered until the end of the process. It's been the infrastructure first, it's been the roads first, and then we're coming in and saying, let's protect this building because it's either historically valued or it's neighborhood value, and yet the general development plan has a road going right through it. That's a really hard conversation to have. So let's have a conversation before that happens, so that all of those elements are as part of that, as opposed to doing it in pieces.
I just want to say, woe to the city that is informed by storage as the design leader, right? Like to your point on the 45th and Washington, I drive by that every day, and I mean, those are the facilities that are now informing design in the future, and I think that is really irresponsible, and I hope we are smarter than that.
Let me just once again jump in there as a bit of a contrarian voice to something that Ian said. While I understand and acknowledge, as many do now, that the design review process can be a very good one, I do not think that a centralized control process at a governmental level is the appropriate resolution to urban planning. And I think very strongly that the private sector brings that element of creativity, including not just economic clout, but creativity and talent to that planning process that is essential. And I'll just give you one example of what's happened in Denver, concrete example of where this will bear me out. When Denver did do its rezoning, it was in a hurry kind of to finish near the end there, and it had some very large tracts out by the Denver airport, DIA. And by large tracts, I mean several hundred acres apiece. And somewhere within that planning process, the decision was made to zone that as what's called PUD, which is Planned Unit Development. Well, PUD in the development arena, without getting too detailed, is what we call recipe zoning. It's very effective for single developments because you have to mandate every single element of what's going to happen there, not just from the size, but from the finish of the exterior, down to the landscaping, the type of plants, the type of grass, everything. In this particular instance, in several instances, we ended up with large tracts of land at DIA, which were overlaid with street grids, because at that particular time, the idea was to enhance or utilize or at least build upon the common street grid system that we have in Denver. The problem with that being designated PUD from a zoning perspective, a grand planning perspective, is that doesn't, once one lot within that PUD is sold, then it no longer can be changed simply by an action of the government or a rezoning or a change of use. Because under a PUD, when a private party buys in reliance on that, And what has happened out there in some areas is that some large developers bought, and so they create 100 lots. Now you have somebody, but it doesn't use the entire 400 acres. It may use 20 acres or 50 acres. Now someone else comes along, another developer, with the idea for a building community. And this actually happened, something that I worked upon, where everyone acknowledges that the actual design and layout was much more akin to what you saw in the slides here as being desirable. But we couldn't get that accomplished by virtue of any application to the city unless we also got the approval of change of every private owner within the boundaries of the PUD. Well, it's not even worth trying. And it's particularly not worth trying if you're representing one developer who's dealing with a competing developer that doesn't want a different kind of project next door. So sometimes you always, in that level of government planning, you got to kind of think to yourself, okay, 5 years down the road, 10 years down the road, I sometimes say, how does the world look to you today versus how you saw it 5 years ago? How does the world look to you today versus how you saw it 10 years ago? Be really careful about the imposition of a grand design at a governmental large-scale planning level that becomes, in effect, immutable or so difficult to change that 5 years down the road when the world changes and all the cars are self-driving, all of a sudden we're left with a legacy that we can't change. So yes, planning, yes, design review. I'm for more gentle in terms of leaving room for the incredible power of the entrepreneurs in our system and the creative people that support development all across the country, what they bring to the table, including the apex, so like an IMPay. But even from there down to the most local level of many of the architects and designers that work in Denver, they're critically talented. And let's,
Yeah.
We really don't want to displace that with a master plan that is so specific and so demanding that you take that element of creativity effectively out of the equation.
I think I just want to clarify from a standpoint of the PUD. I think what you're talking about from a master plan is exactly right. I do want to caution, though, that we have found PUDs to be very valuable in very specific smaller areas that have interesting solutions or interesting problems that are looking for a solution that can't be solved by the current zoning.
Absolutely, we do
Yeah.
it all across the country. The problem is when you apply you apply the sledgehammer
Yes.
when you needed a fly swatter, and that's what happens when you do 100-acre land use planning with PUD.
Yeah, and I also want to clarify the situation you're talking about is an old code PUD. It was written under the old zoning, and it's stuck in the rules of the old zoning, which is where that rule lives. We agree with you. Doesn't make sense, and that wouldn't happen to a new code PUD. That's an old code.
Thousands of acres out there that are.
Yeah, and I think the city's interested in working on a solution for that because of the fact that they're stuck in those old rules. But I think things do evolve, and there's a lot that you said the city agrees with.
With that being said, I think we could have a whole nother one about old code, new code. But I just want to say thanks to the panelists for being here. Thanks to everyone who's watching. Support Denver INC, get involved in your neighborhood organizations, and hopefully we'll be coming back with another one of these. I know our membership has been asking for one around smart cities.